In the spring of 1945, American soldiers discovered something inside a German mine shaft that made hardened military men go pale. Hundreds of tons of uranium ore, carefully hidden, carefully guarded, sitting just miles from where the war was ending. The Nazis hadn't built the bomb. But they had been trying. And the margin between their failure and success was razor thin. What if they had gotten there first? What if the most evil regime in human history had held the most destructive weapon ever created? The world came closer to that nightmare than most people will ever know. Picture the year 1938. Adolf Hitler has already swallowed Austria and is eyeing the rest of Europe like a hungry wolf. His Germany is the most scientifically advanced nation on Earth. German physicists are the best in the world, Nobel Prize winners, quantum mechanics pioneers, men whose names fill the textbooks of every university. While American scientists are still catching up, Germany is already running laps around them. Then something extraordinary happens. Two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working in a Berlin laboratory, split the uranium atom for the first time in history. They don't fully understand what they've done yet. But a refugee Jewish physicist named Lise Meitner, who had just fled Nazi persecution to Sweden, does. She runs the numbers. She writes the equations. She realizes, with trembling hands, that the energy released by splitting the atom is almost incomprehensible. She calls it fission. Word spreads fast through the scientific community. Within months, physicists on both sides of the Atlantic understand the terrifying implication. If you could sustain a chain reaction, if you could keep those atoms splitting, one after another in a cascade, you wouldn't just have energy. You'd have a weapon capable of destroying an entire city in a single, blinding flash. The race had begun. And in 1938, Germany was winning. Part 1: Germany's Secret Weapon Program. The German nuclear weapons program had a name that would have chilled the blood of Allied commanders had they known it in full: Uranverein. The Uranium Club. It launched in April 1939, months before World War II even officially began. The Reich brought together some of the most brilliant minds in German science, and pointed them at a single goal: build a weapon that could end all wars, on Germany's terms. Leading the effort was a man named Werner Heisenberg, one of the greatest theoretical physicists who had ever lived. He had already won the Nobel Prize at just 31 years old. He understood quantum mechanics at a level almost no other human being could match. If anyone could build Hitler a nuclear bomb, it was Werner Heisenberg. He was brilliant, meticulous, and loyal enough to stay in Germany when most of his Jewish colleagues had already fled. The Allies would spend the next 6 years terrified of what he might produce. Germany's early advantages were staggering. They controlled the world's only significant supply of heavy water, a critical ingredient for certain types of nuclear reactors, through the Vemork hydroelectric plant in occupied Norway. They had access to vast uranium deposits in Czechoslovakia, which Hitler had already seized. They had the scientists, the resources, and a dictator willing to fund anything that promised him victory. They had a 2-year head start on the Americans. In 1939, if you had to bet on who would build the bomb first, you would have bet on Germany. Now here is where the story becomes one of the most dramatic in human history, because despite all of those advantages, something went wrong for the Nazis. Several somethings. And every single one of those somethings involved a human being making a choice that quietly saved the world. Part 2: The Scientists Who Fled. The first miracle that doomed the Nazi bomb program was Hitler's own racism. Beginning in 1933, the Nazi regime began systematically destroying its own scientific community. Jewish professors were fired from universities. Jewish researchers were stripped of their positions. Jewish Nobel laureates were forced to flee for their lives. In their arrogance, the Nazis called modern physics, relativity, quantum mechanics, Judenphysik, Jewish physics, degenerate science, unworthy of the master race. What they were actually doing was handing the future to America. Consider the names that left Germany and ended up working on the American bomb: Albert Einstein, who wrote the famous letter to President Roosevelt warning him about nuclear weapons; Leo Szilard, the Hungarian-born physicist who had actually conceived of the nuclear chain reaction years earlier. Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius who would build the world's first nuclear reactor under the bleachers of a University of Chicago football stadium. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, John von Neumann, Klaus Fuchs. One by one, the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century packed their bags, said goodbye to the world they knew, and boarded ships to America, many of them carrying nothing but their knowledge and their desperation. Robert Oppenheimer, the American who would eventually lead the Manhattan Project, later said that the European refugees brought something beyond their equations. They brought urgency. They knew Hitler personally. They had watched their colleagues dragged away. They understood, in a way that comfortable American scientists could not, exactly what was at stake. They weren't building a bomb. They were building survival. Lise Meitner, the woman who had first understood fission, was offered a place on the Manhattan Project. She turned it down. She refused to work on a weapon of mass destruction, even against the regime that had persecuted her. She spent the war in Sweden, listening to news reports on the radio, carrying the weight of a discovery she wished she had never made. Part 3: The Men in the Mountains. While American scientists raced toward New Mexico, a quiet, desperate drama was playing out in the mountains of Norway. The Vemork plant, the one producing Germany's heavy water supply, sat on a cliff ledge above a 600-foot gorge in the middle of winter in occupied Norway. German guards were everywhere. The only approach was across a narrow bridge or through a valley that was completely exposed. The Allies had already tried bombing it from the air, failed. They had already tried sending in a British glider team, catastrophic failure, with the survivors executed by the Gestapo. It seemed untouchable. So the British Special Operations Executive tried something almost suicidal. They dropped a team of 9 Norwegian commandos, all volunteers, into the frozen wilderness nearby. The men were Joachim Ronneberg, Knut Haukelid, and their team of brothers. They ski-traveled for weeks through one of the harshest environments on Earth, half-starved, surviving on moss and melted snow. When they finally reached Vemork, they did something the Germans hadn't guarded against because no sane person would attempt it. They climbed down into the frozen gorge. In the dead of winter, in the dead of night, they scrambled down a 600-foot ice-covered cliff, crept along the bottom of the gorge, climbed up the other side, and squeezed through a cable duct, a tiny maintenance passage, into the very heart of the plant. They placed their charges on the heavy water production cells. They set their timers. They got out. The explosion was small enough that the German guards barely reacted. They assumed it was a mechanical failure. But when engineers reached the production floor, the damage was catastrophic. Months of irreplaceable heavy water production lay destroyed on the floor. Not a single man was killed on either side that night. Joachim Ronneberg was 23 years old. The Germans rebuilt. And when they tried to ship their remaining heavy water reserves by rail to Germany in 1944, Knut Haukelid, still operating behind enemy lines, snuck aboard the ferry that would carry the railcars across Lake Tinsjo and planted a bomb in its hull. The ferry went to the bottom of the lake. The heavy water went with it. A few Norwegian civilians died. Haukelid would carry that grief for the rest of his life. But the heavy water never reached Germany. Part 4: Heisenberg's Mysterious Mistake. Here is where history becomes genuinely puzzling, and where the margin between our world and a Nazi nuclear world becomes almost impossibly thin. Werner Heisenberg made mistakes. Critical ones. The central mystery of the German nuclear program is whether Heisenberg made those mistakes because he couldn't see the correct path, or because he secretly didn't want to. The key error involved calculating what physicists call critical mass, the amount of fissile material you need to sustain a chain reaction and create an explosion. Heisenberg calculated that you would need tons of uranium-235 to build a bomb. This made the project seem essentially impossible. No country could enrich that much uranium in wartime. The American scientists calculated the true answer, roughly 15 pounds. You don't need a mountain of material. You need a small, elegant sphere of metal about the size of a grapefruit. If Heisenberg had gotten that calculation right, Germany's entire nuclear program would have accelerated overnight. Resources that had been deemed unavailable suddenly would have seemed achievable. The timeline would have compressed from impossible in wartime to potentially achievable by 1945. It is one of the most consequential arithmetic errors, or acts of possible sabotage, in the history of science. After the war, Heisenberg was captured and held at a country house in England called Farm Hall, along with 9 other German nuclear scientists. The British bugged the entire house. When the German scientists heard the news that the Americans had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, their conversations were secretly recorded. Heisenberg's reaction was extraordinary. He seemed genuinely surprised, not that the bomb had worked, but at how the Americans had solved the technical problems he had considered nearly insurmountable. Was he a man who had genuinely failed? Or a man who had quietly ensured failure, at enormous personal risk, while serving under the most murderous regime in history? We still don't know. Heisenberg took the answer to his grave. He died in Munich in 1976, still brilliant, still controversial, still ambiguous. The moment everything changed, the moment the race was truly decided, came not in a laboratory, but in a desert. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico, the world's first nuclear device detonated. The scientists who had gathered to watch it, men who had spent years working toward this exact moment, were overwhelmed by what they saw. The blast equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. A fireball that rose into the sky and became something no human being had ever seen before. A shockwave that knocked men off their feet miles away. A flash that was visible from 200 miles in every direction. Robert Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker, thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." General Thomas Farrell, who was standing beside him, later described the sound that arrived after the flash. He said it was like the crack of doom, like every terrible noise in human history compressed into a single moment and unleashed at once. The test was called Trinity. And it meant Germany had lost the race. But here is the razor's edge. The Trinity test happened 6 weeks after Germany surrendered. 6 weeks. If the war in Europe had continued for just 6 more weeks, if D-Day had failed, if the Battle of the Bulge had gone differently, if any one of a dozen things had broken the other way, America might have been racing to use its bomb against the Nazis before they could use theirs. The margin was that thin. When Allied forces swept through Germany in the final weeks of the war, they launched a secret mission called Operation Alsos, a team of scientists and intelligence officers racing ahead of the front lines to find out exactly how close Germany had come. What they found was simultaneously reassuring and horrifying. The Germans had not built a bomb. They hadn't even come close to building a bomb. Their program was years behind the Americans. But they had gathered significant quantities of uranium. They had been working on experimental nuclear reactors. They had the theoretical knowledge. What they had lacked was the organizational infrastructure, the industrial capacity, the refugee brainpower, and crucially, a leader who had prioritized the program with the urgency it deserved. Hitler, in his limited scientific understanding, had largely dismissed the bomb as a Jewish science fantasy. He preferred rockets. He preferred jets. He preferred the visible, kinetic weapons of war over the invisible, theoretical promise of the atom. It was the most consequential scientific prejudice in history. The American team also launched Operation Paperclip, a controversial program to bring German scientists to the United States before the Soviets could grab them. Over 1,600 German scientists were recruited, including rocket pioneer Werner von Braun, whose V-2 rockets had rained destruction on London, built using slave labor from Nazi concentration camps. Von Braun would later help design the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon. The moral complexity of that legacy is something America has never fully resolved. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, killed between 130,000 and 226,000 people, most of them civilians. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. So consider this: the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was nicknamed Little Boy. It weighed about 9,700 pounds. The explosive yield was the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. The city of Hiroshima, a living city with hospitals, schools, streetcars, children eating breakfast, was obliterated in approximately 1 second. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. And the world would never be the same. Now step back. Take all of that history and ask the question that haunted Allied commanders throughout the entire war. What if it had been Germany's bomb? In the early 1940s, German rocket scientists were already developing the A-10 rocket, a transatlantic ballistic missile designed to hit the east coast of the United States. It was never completed. But the design existed. The ambition existed. If Germany had successfully enriched uranium, if Heisenberg's calculations had been correct, if the Norwegian heavy water supply had survived, if Hitler had prioritized the project, they would have had a delivery mechanism capable of reaching New York. Think about what that means. A Nazi Germany with a nuclear weapon in 1944 or even early 1945 could have used it to flatten London before D-Day, potentially canceling the Allied invasion of Europe before it began. It could have destroyed the massed Allied armies gathering in southern England. It could have threatened Moscow, forcing Stalin into a separate peace. It could have threatened Washington, D.C., demanding American withdrawal from the war entirely. One bomb over London. One bomb over Moscow. One bomb over Washington. The war would not simply have continued. It would have ended, on Hitler's terms. Picture a world in which D-Day never happens because London no longer exists. In which Stalin signs a humiliating peace treaty because his capital lies in radioactive ash. In which President Roosevelt, or his successor, faces a phone call from Berlin, stand down, or New York is next. What does America do? Military historians have debated this for decades. The most brutally honest answer is this: we probably surrender. Not because Americans lack courage, but because the math is impossible. One bomb can kill 100,000 people in a single moment. No army, no navy, no air force can defend against a weapon like that. You cannot shoot down every plane. You cannot sink every submarine. You cannot stop a rocket that arrives faster than sound. A Nazi Germany with nuclear weapons would not simply have won World War II. It would have won the 20th century. The Holocaust, which had already murdered 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, would have continued unchecked. The plan for the occupied East, which called for the starvation and enslavement of tens of millions of Slavic people to create living space for German settlers, would have proceeded. The Reich that Hitler planned to last 1,000 years would have had the nuclear sword needed to enforce that ambition. Every map on Earth would eventually have been redrawn. 5 separate things saved the world. Any one of them failing would have changed everything. First, Hitler's racism destroyed his own program. By driving out his best Jewish scientists, he handed America a generation of refugee geniuses who were personally motivated to stop him. Leo Szilard, Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi. These were not just intelligent people. They were furious people. They understood Hitler viscerally. Their desperation became America's greatest weapon. Second, the Norwegian commandos destroyed the heavy water supply. Without heavy water, the German reactor program stalled. Without a working reactor, Heisenberg could not demonstrate a sustained chain reaction. Without that demonstration, German military leadership, already skeptical, could not be convinced to pour resources into the program. 9 men on skis, climbing down an ice-covered cliff in the dark, changed the outcome of the war. Third, Heisenberg made his critical mass error. Whether it was genuine confusion or something more deliberate, his wildly inflated estimate of how much fissile material a bomb required made the project seem economically and logistically impossible. German leadership looked at those numbers and redirected resources to more achievable weapons. Fourth, American industrial capacity was incomparable. The Manhattan Project cost approximately $2.2 billion, equivalent to roughly $36 billion today. It employed 130,000 people across 30 sites. It consumed more electricity than some entire states. Germany, fighting a two-front war with supply lines under constant air attack, could never have matched that industrial mobilization. Fifth, time ran out. Between Allied bombing campaigns destroying German infrastructure, the liberation of occupied territories cutting off resource supplies, and the relentless grinding advance of Allied forces on both fronts, Germany simply ran out of room and time. Even if every other factor had broken differently, the sheer military pressure of fighting America, Britain, and the Soviet Union simultaneously may have overwhelmed the program before it could reach completion. Remove any one of those 5 factors. Just one. And we are not having this conversation. Not in a free country. Not in a free world. The nuclear age that began in that New Mexico desert in July 1945 did not end wars. It just changed their shape. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb, helped partly by spies who had stolen American secrets from inside the Manhattan Project itself. Within a decade, both America and the Soviet Union had hydrogen bombs, weapons hundreds of times more powerful than the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cold War that followed was, at its core, a 45-year standoff kept in uneasy peace by the simple, terrifying logic that both sides could destroy the world, so neither side dared to start. That logic, called mutual assured destruction, with an acronym so perfect it seems invented, MAD, protected the peace through Cuban Missile Crises and proxy wars and decades of paranoia. It was a peace held together by fear. But it held. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. An estimated 12,500 nuclear warheads exist on Earth. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, the weapon that shocked the world, that ended the war, that changed civilization, would be considered small and primitive by modern standards. The largest nuclear weapon ever tested, the Soviet Tsar Bomba, detonated in 1961, was 3,300 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. We live, every day, in a world that exists because the right people won a race they didn't fully know they were running. The men who built the Nazi nuclear program failed, through incompetence, through loss of resources, through the choices of a few extraordinary human beings who stood in their way. The men who built the American bomb succeeded, through genius, through sacrifice, through the desperate energy of refugees who understood exactly what they were running from. And the margin between those two outcomes was measured not in years, but in months. In pounds of heavy water. In the miscalculations of a single brilliant man. In 9 commandos willing to climb down a cliff in the dark. Joachim Ronneberg, the young Norwegian commander who led the raid on Vemork, lived to be 99 years old. He never spoke much about what he had done. When interviewers pressed him, he would deflect with modesty, with humor, with the quiet reserve of a man who had done something extraordinary, and simply returned to living. Shortly before he died in 2018, he was asked if he understood the significance of that night on the cliff. He thought about it. Then he said something simple and devastating. "We were just boys who wanted to go home." They were boys who wanted to go home. And because they were brave enough to first go into the gorge, because they were willing to do the impossible thing in the darkest moment, the world they came home to was still worth coming home to. Never forget how close it was. Never forget how much we owe to people whose names most of us will never know. And never, for a single comfortable moment, take for granted the world they saved.